Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of June 13th, 2021. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I'm the chairman of the US Transhumanist Party. And today we have our distinguished panel of US Transhumanist Party officers and members. We have our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia. We have our Director of Applied Innovation, David Shoemaker. We have our Director of Community Resilience, Alexandria Black. We have our Foreign Ambassador in Spain and Technology Advisor, Jose Cordero. We have our member, Jason Geringer. And our special guest today is our longtime friend and collaborator, Victor Björk. Victor is a longtime activist for Healthy Life Extension. He is a director of the Healthy Life Extension Society, or HEALS, which is a Brussels-based NGO think tank that organizes conferences and events on aging biotechnology. He is a molecular biologist who studied at Uppsala University. He is an expert on aging, drawing upon over 12 years of experience tracking companies and daily reading of scientific publications on aging. He previously worked at two leading companies in the field, BioAge Labs in San Francisco and Ichor Therapeutics in New York. He has been a speaker at multiple conferences and for different organizations on the topic of aging. In April 2021, he founded Victor Björk Geroconsulting, which advises venture capital on aging research. So welcome, Victor. You certainly have already had a distinguished career in aging research, and you have paired that with extensive public activism for life extension and making sure that we reach longevity escape velocity within our lifetimes. So certainly I would consider you to be one of the most dedicated and passionate and informed advocates for longevity today. But I think what interests a lot of our audience is, how does one get to become such a person? What first interested you in the field of longevity, and how did your path take you towards such extensive involvement in both research and activism?
Thank you very much, Gennady. That is a very long story. I actually grew up in northern Sweden, and my family were not scientists or anything in that field, but I was always a very curious child, curious about existence, curious about philosophy and about how the world worked. But I did not understand why it was considered acceptable that people would only live to the age of 80 and 90 and die a horrific death after that. To me, it was obvious that everybody should be allowed to live as long as they like. And even if that was not possible, at least people should do everything they could in order to achieve that goal. So what I will say distinguishes me from a lot of other people in the scientific field is that I'm mission-oriented. I specifically studied molecular biology in order to be able to influence the cure of aging in the future. And a lot of other people who are into science, they are interested in science, whether that applications happen to be mission-oriented or not. So it's a long story. And also when I was during my teenage years, I got more and more interested in this, because then I was working in nursing homes. So I saw how much people suffered, and that this is actually a reality, and you're not exposed to that reality when you are not living in a nursing home or working there. And I was quite shocked that the rest of the people, why are we not doing everything we can to prevent ourselves from getting into that state within a few decades from now?
Yes, and this mission-oriented quality that you had, it kept you motivated through all of your years of study and your work for a variety of organizations to essentially build up your skill set, build up your network of people who then provided these opportunities for further work for you. Now, what advice would you have for others who may be at the start of their career trajectories and they also have similar goals? They want to see the reversal of biological aging achieved, and they're curious about what they can do. And you've clearly found a path for yourself in terms of what you can do. What should they look into as they start finding their own paths?
To begin with, I will say that something that I suffered from up until just a few years ago was the assumption that everybody is doing something about this and that it's going to take care of itself. I had this subconscious feeling that there's some super smart professor at Harvard who is in charge of curing aging. It's about to happen anyway, so why should little me care about this mission, because it's going to happen anyway. But I think the feeling that you can actually, as an individual, contribute a lot to this is something that you must embrace. And even if you think it is going to happen by itself without your own involvement, the stakes are like very binary, life or death. So even if you think it's 99% certain we will cure aging in 20 years, there's 1% chance we will not cure aging in 20 years. So I think that is a very good way of gaining motivation for this cause.
Yes, and I'm also curious if our panelists have questions for Victor along these lines as well. Jose, what would you like to ask?
Well, thank you very much. And Victor, since you are also in Europe, like me in Madrid here, and you are in Sweden, how do you compare the different views? Maybe from Europe to the USA, or even from Northern Europe, Sweden, Southern Europe, Spain, and North America. And since you are so young, relatively speaking, in fact, you are the youngest person here in this group, how optimistic are you regarding the speed of these technological advances to cure aging and to reverse aging? Because you have longer time to live than most of us here.
Well, to address the first questions about the different attitudes in different countries, my experience is that Americans are, of course, quite dynamic and initiative-taking. They found more companies in the field, like in the Bay Area, lots of people are starting up their own anti-aging startups and so on. And it's less of that dynamic entrepreneurial mindset, I will say, in biotech in Europe in general. And I think there is also almost like they trust the government more, that the government is going to do something about it. And despite that the government doesn't do anything about it, there's still some assumption that, yeah, someone else is in charge, without getting political. And so I think that is a major cultural difference between countries. And when it comes to the time frame for developments, I think it is there's so much going on in the lab, and there's so much that exists already, but it's not translatable, and you cannot run clinical trials on humans. And I think many people underestimate that, because they think that basically creating molecules that can influence pathways of aging and repair and restore damage, that is the impossibly difficult path, because the molecular biology is so extremely messy and complex. But then they forget how much is actually known in the molecular biology already. So it's not as difficult as it seems necessarily, but it's almost impossible to translate it in and get it over into humans. So that is an aspect that's very, very underestimated. So it's very hard for me to give a time frame for when things will develop. But I would like to point out that even though it's pretty minimal, there are things out there already, like senolytics. They truly reverse an aspect of aging, and they exist here and now. I mean, I don't think they are by themselves are going to add many years in humans, because the different aging damages accumulate at roughly the same rate. So by just cutting down on one of the aspects, that will not necessarily give a lot more life, but the principle is there, that you can today partially repair and partially rejuvenate people truly. So
yes, indeed. And this is quite interesting too, because around 2015, I would have said that all of the components of the SENS approach, for instance, are still in the future, and there are no consumer applications yet for any of them. But right now, the picture is a bit, let's say, more optimistic in the sense that there are some drugs and treatments that could have some efficacy in slowing down parts of the aging process already. And you mentioned senolytics. So that is quite promising. And I think we should discuss this further. But right now, our audience seems to have essentially resoundingly agreed with you with regard to the problems with nursing homes in the status quo. Jennifer Hughes in the YouTube chat says, yes, nursing homes need to be reformed. And Alexandria Black stated that unfortunately she couldn't do much to get the nursing homes to save her parents. And she knew of things that could have helped them, but the nursing homes essentially ignored any potential to explore emerging experimental treatments. So Alexandria, if you'd like to elaborate on that, and then we'll get Victor's thoughts and hear if his impressions of the nursing home situation are similar.
Okay. I was trying to type something in chat a little bit different. I was wondering how much you would target inflammation as one of the key pathways to aging. But yes, I know several things that would help my parents. I couldn't even get mom hyperbaric oxygen for dementia, which is clearly in the guidelines, but it's being sent elsewhere, you know. Just several things like ISRIB would have helped with her dementia. Stem cells would have helped after dad's stroke. But let's get back to inflammation. How much would you want to target that?
Well, obviously, I will want to target inflammation because that is something that is upregulated in old age, and it's something bad. If you exercise more and you take things like metformin and the possibly rapamycin as well, you can reduce inflammation. And if you remove senescent cells, you also reduce inflammation because the senescent cells secrete inflammatory compounds in an old person. So obviously, it's a good thing to target inflammation, but it's also a bit of a it's secondary to tissue damage, because if the tissue damage had not occurred in the first place, there wouldn't be an inflammation. So yes, while dampening that down, that's good, but ultimately it's not the perfect way of restoring somebody.
Was it David Sinclair who said lately that inflammation is a good thing when you're younger until it gets out of hand?
Yeah, sure, because the body reacts on itself. When you have an old person, the tissues are damaged, and the body responds to that in the same way as an injury, but to all this subtle molecular garbage that fills up old people's bodies. So it's immunity against itself in a way.
Yes, indeed. And Victor, with regard to problems in the nursing home system, what are some of the specific issues that you have observed? Why are nursing homes not particularly receptive to emerging advances that could help prolong the patients' lives? After all, the patients are the customers too. So hypothetically, if they're alive for longer, they could pay the nursing home for a longer period of time.
Well, of course, it's a main problem of being able to self-experiment. People do not own their bodies. You cannot give patients senolytics and things that might be a bit experimental. We have this general rule as a result of the Hippocrates Oath that if somebody is harmed the slightest by the physician, there's somebody to blame and sue. But if they die from the cancer itself, then we point the blame at the cancer. No one is there to take the blame. So that's the general problem, of course. I don't think there's anything wrong necessarily with individual doctors, but they are very, very locked by the system. They cannot do a lot. Personally, I like the idea very much that people should self-experiment, and we should do whatever we can within reason to help prolong our lives, especially if you're old and frail. I mean, obviously I can say this because I'm a biologist, so I don't have any MD degree that you can take away from me. So, but if I was an MD, I would be very, very afraid of saying any such thing. So.
Yes, and it's a shame that there is this institutional pressure on individuals who are otherwise competent and qualified and interested in these emerging treatments, but they're afraid of what the institutions would do if they spoke too far out of line. Now, along these lines, though, I know that in different countries, there are different regimes with regard to various drugs and treatments and their availability. For instance, in the United States, metformin is only available with a doctor's prescription, and some doctors are more receptive to prescribing it to non-diabetic patients than others, but most will still say, well, you don't have diabetes, so why do you need metformin? John H. is wondering, is metformin available in Sweden without a prescription?
No, metformin is not available without a prescription in Sweden. It's actually available without prescription in Italy and Spain. Italy and Spain, everybody can just go and buy metformin and self-experiment, even if you're young and healthy. So I've experienced that myself. So that, yes, that's a varying thing between countries. But I would like to point out that, of course, we have 190 different countries in the world. So we have many different laws when it comes to being able to do, for example, offshore medical tourism. So I can see the market in that. But I want to point out that when it comes to drug development against aging, essentially all of that has to do with either the FDA or the European Medical Association. If a drug is not going to be approved in these countries, there's no point in trying to develop it elsewhere anyway, because it will never pay off. So yes, you can go to Cayman Island and do offshore treatments, but you cannot develop a drug, get it approved in Cayman Island, and then distribute it worldwide. No company will ever do that. So as long as you have the FDA and the European Medical Association that doesn't think that aging is a disease in itself, that's a major issue, unless you can go around that with other target indications.
So yes, that seems to be a major problem. So you think medical tourism can work for drugs that have already been developed and widely available with or without a prescription, but then people who really want or need the drug can go to a country that doesn't require a prescription and purchase it. On the other hand, for developing new drugs, you seem to think companies will not bother, even if, for instance, the Cayman Islands medical agency, whichever agency there is responsible for reviewing the new medical treatments and substances, will say, well, yes, we'll give approval to this to be used for willing patients. You don't think there's a company that will want to have a business model of getting approval, manufacturing the drug in the Cayman Islands, and then inviting medical tourists to come over and try the drug or the procedure, if it's a procedure?
No, I mean, obviously the billion-dollar markets derive from the US and Europe, essentially. That's fact.
Yes, so this is an example of how several large institutions and powerful countries or collections of countries have the ability to slow down progress worldwide. Now, what would you say are the differences between the barriers that the FDA puts forth versus the European Medicines Agency? Which one is more stringent? Which one is less stringent? Or are there some areas in which one is more stringent and the other is less stringent, and vice versa?
I cannot give a very, very generalized answer to that question. Obviously, there are many cases where things are approved in Europe, but not in the US, and vice versa. So it all might cancel out kind of equally in that sense. But
right. And we saw that with vaccines for COVID-19 to a great extent. For instance, the United States FDA, I think, initially moved somewhat slower than the European Medicines Agency, especially given how early on in the pandemic the Moderna vaccine was available. Yet by late 2020, the US had given emergency use authorization to vaccines long before the European Medicines Agency. And then the European Medicines Agency I don't think it was the direct instigator of this, but it seemed to ultimately cave in to pressure from national governments to withdraw the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine because a very small proportion of the population, and mostly young females, experience blood clots, and yet they withdrew the approval for all segments of the population, including those who weren't at risk of getting the blood clots. So it seems that there are situations where the FDA might seem overly stringent at first, but the EMA does have more of this precautionary mentality ultimately, and in the long run it seems to delay especially certain very innovative treatments. Would that also be your impression?
Yes.
Okay, so we also know that one of the entrepreneurs who is most active in the longevity field is from Germany, Michael Greve, who is now funding a lot of longevity startups. And Alexandria is curious if you're familiar with his work.
Yes, sure. He has been at the conferences I organized and so on, so I know him, yes.
Excellent. So money is now coming from him. Money is also coming from certain cryptocurrency millionaires like Vitalik Buterin of Ethereum. So what are your thoughts of the funding situation with regard to longevity research? Obviously, we would all want much more funding to flow into this area, but do you think the situation is improving now that individuals with some serious net worth are investing large amounts of money into research?
Yes, of course, it's definitely improving, but it's of course far from proportionate to the enormous problem that aging is. So it's still a drop in the ocean. And another problem is, of course, what people mean when they use the word longevity. What is a longevity company? Will a longevity company, as it's called, produce anything useful? Are they able to execute and deliver their product? Will the product work in the first place? How do they define longevity? Maybe longevity is healthy eating and nutrition. According to some people, it gets very diluted. What's going to work? What's not going to work?
I know that Aubrey de Grey has critiqued some of the more conventional so-called longevity companies like Alphabet's Calico or Mark Zuckerberg's initiative to cure all diseases in this century. And his main critique was these initiatives, even though they're publicized and well-funded, they seem to operate in a silo where they don't communicate with actual experts in rejuvenation biotechnology, people like Aubrey de Grey, people like yourself or Bill Andrews. And what do you think is the reason for this disconnect? Why is it that there's all this money on the one hand and all this expertise on the other hand, but the people with the money, apart from individuals like Vitalik Buterin, Michael Greve, a few others, Peter Thiel on occasion, the others, the people with an order of magnitude more money, won't communicate with the people who have already been active, sometimes for decades, in trying to solve this problem?
Well, I obviously do not have any insights in why it functions in that way, but I don't see, for example, any people that they hired or anything like that suggest that they are about to deliver a drug to the market. So of course, some people take the approach that you need to do a lot of basic research in order to understand aging better, and that's the way to go. So I cannot give an easy answer to that. I'm just not aware that they are actually about to try to deliver something actionable that is going to benefit humans in the short term.
Mm-hmm. So they're primarily focused on basic theoretical research. I did see various posts on social media about Calico releasing a paper recently after 8 years. Do you think this is a positive development, at least showing that they are doing something, and maybe this is a prelude to other more actionable initiatives?
Well, they have released a few papers before, not a lot, but still. The people that they hire are generally people who are with a background in C. elegans and basic research. I am not aware that they have a lot of people from the pharmaceutical industry that are experts in commercializing any therapy. So based on that, I'm not aware that we should expect that they will have a drug out on the market within a few years.
So Jason Geringer is wondering, is there any sort of problem with getting volunteers for studies? I know that in some cases with certain gene therapy studies, there may be an issue, especially if the study is self-funded or expensive. Would you say cost of participation is the main problem, or do you not see much of a problem? Do you think if there were more clinical trials available, there would be plenty of volunteers for them?
Well, I mean, we certainly have already things like Senolytics that you could easily run many trials on for different age-related indications. So if there's an interest, I think that in a lot of countries you could, for example, make more clinical trials on things like fibrosis and other age-related diseases and see if they improve in response to Senolytics. So I think that's kind of a lack of interest and knowledge. If people wanted, they could really do a lot there. When it comes to gene therapy, that is of course very, very expensive, and it's not scalable very easily either. You cannot, I mean, you can't really get down the cost quickly by having more people participating. A gene therapy costs $500,000 to $1 million, and people will have to pay that out of their own pocket, which sharply limits the number of people who are going to participate, especially if it's not a direct manner of life and death, but something that's more of a nuisance that might or might not influence aging. So.
Yes, and for a number of years, Bill Andrews had been trying to start up trials for an experimental gene therapy with Labella Gene Therapeutics, and he wanted to treat Alzheimer's disease as the first target. And for a long time, he seemed to be on the verge of getting some famous individuals who are late in their lives and perhaps may be afflicted by Alzheimer's disease to be among the patients, but it was difficult because of the monetary considerations. He said that essentially the first therapy would cost around $1 million, maybe more, but his hope eventually would be to get it to the level where most consumers would be able to afford it, just as they would be able to afford a fairly routine medical treatment. How far away do you think we are from a technical standpoint of achieving that goal of scaling gene therapy so that it becomes among the suite of treatment options that a person of ordinary means can access?
And I think that's going to be very hard. Actually, it's a matter of scalability and the amount of work that it takes to create a therapy that is clinically relevant for a human in a lab with the vectors and everything. It is going to require a lot of work for every individual, and it's not going to be very easy to bring it down, similar to how we broke down the cost of sequencing a human genome. I mean, it went from millions to like a few $100 genome. So, but I don't see that will be easily happen with gene therapy, even if there was a huge demand and people were willing to pay. Yes, of course, it's going to go down somewhat, but I don't think we can see in any foreseeable future like a few $100 gene therapy in humans.
So what would be any treatment, say within the next decade, that might conceivably cost a few $100s and be fairly effective in reversing biological aging, by which I would mean if a person has a debilitating disease, it would be cured or set back, or a person could be visibly and functionally younger, like you might start having 70-year-olds who look like they're 50?
Well, what I could see that Well, I mean, I see some partial things that could go quickly, but now I cannot say about how quickly the companies will operate. But for example, breaking down the TTR amyloidosis, which is the most common cause of heart failure in people who are well over 90 years old. That's like a universal pathology. You get this protein clumps in the heart that makes it beat less well, and you get heart failure when you're really old. And now there are companies like Covalent Biosciences that have catabodies that can remove that, and they are even talking about having a vaccine against this, so you could remove this particular age-related condition that everybody gets. And that, you could imagine, will not be that extraordinarily expensive. And the same comes with senolytics, better senolytics, a better understanding of cellular senescence, and a senolytic that is superior to the cheap dasatinib and the quercetin and fisetin that we know of today. That's the things that I can see are not going to cost a ridiculous amount of money, like gene therapy.
Mm-hmm. So Jason is wondering, is gene therapy difficult to scale because everyone's genes are different and you don't have a one-size-fits-all solution? Is that the bottleneck here?
Well, I mean, obviously you have to deliver an enormous amount of viral vectors to a person's body, and that costs a lot to manufacture. So that's...
So the manufacturing issue is a bottleneck.
What would you call that? Viral vectors?
Viral vectors.
Viral vectors. Okay.
Yes. So gene therapy is delivered via inactivated viruses as carriers for genetic material. And Victor, perhaps you might want to explain that to a greater extent to the audience in terms of what this approach involves and what steps are taken to make sure the viruses are not damaging and that there are no adverse side effects.
Well, obviously, the most common vectors are lentiviruses or adenoviruses that you use in order to deliver the gene therapy. But then it, of course, has to target the correct tissue, and it has to be especially something that we know can be targeted and that has been proven to not have off-target effects. So there's a lot of basic research that needs to be done for a lot of off-targets before. And of course, I want also to distinguish two different types of gene therapies, and that is, of course, being able to manipulate existing genes that we know of today. For example, the myostatin inhibitor gene therapy that Liz Parrish is known for. That is something that we know the gene, we can affect it currently, but there is also the type of gene therapies that involve putting in other genetic things in the body, like for example microbial genes that could break down a particular form of aging damage that we don't have naturally. So it's either the manipulation of existing genes or artificially setting things up that could answer. So that's two different fields.
Yes, thank you. And Alexandria is wondering, are there any strategies to help doctors be less constrained by institutions, whether it would be, say, the medical licensing bodies or governments or corporations, any organization that wants a doctor to just do the conventional thing, not take any risks, not do anything experimental, even if it might save a person's life. It's sad, Alexandria says, that these doctors are not free to try promising treatments, even if they personally think those treatments are worthy of at least an attempt.
Yes, sure, but I think that is a very complex area to try to do anything about. Obviously, that will be offshore tourism, where people are allowed to do treatments that they would not be allowed to do in a particular region.
Yes, and we discussed medical tourism already. I'm curious, do a lot of people from Sweden, for instance, go to Italy or Spain to get their metformin? Do they go to other European countries, given that travel in the European Union is fairly easy to undertake in order to pursue a treatment that may not be as available in Sweden as it might be somewhere else?
Yes, sure. I mean, So that's a bit funny, because of course you can go to Italy if you're a Swedish person, you can fill your whole bag with metformin, like you can fill it with 1,000 pills, and no one cares when you enter the airport, but you cannot get a single pill from your local doctor. So it's quite ridiculous, actually. But obviously the laws have been created, and that's simply how it works. It's just like, for example, in Sweden, you can buy 500 milligrams aspirin pills for your headache, but you cannot buy 100 milligram aspirin pills that are thought to affect headache for blood clots, because that's called a heart drug. So you're allowed to buy the 500 milligram, but not allowed to buy the 100 milligram of the same substance.
Yes, and that is indeed quite ridiculous, given that the person who might want the 100 milligram dose, I suppose he could cut the pill in 5 portions, although it would be messy.
Yeah, exactly. He could do that, but he cannot get the small quantity because that's a drug, apparently.
Interesting. So John H. in the YouTube chat suggests, and I think this is quite a sensible idea, that in a nursing home or hospital setting, the patient or the guardian of the patient should be able to sign a waiver that holds the nursing home or hospital harmless if there are adverse consequences, but essentially that would be the patient signaling to the institution that I really want to try this, I think this might work, and if you let me try this, I'm not going to sue you, I'm not going to inflict any adverse consequences upon you, but I really want this chance to attempt this treatment. Do you think this kind of strategy could work, or would there be other obstacles to getting it implemented?
Well, I think there will be quite a few obstacles there, at least in Europe and the countries that I'm aware of, the laws in. What would work most likely would be if you have a gigantic self-experiment group, like lots of old people who have like a self-experiment network, and as private individuals without the supervision of someone who claims to conduct a clinical trial or compassionate use, that they just obtain their products and self-experiment and document their own data. That will be, of course, the way around that. But then, of course, many very old people have given up, and I sometimes wonder what is the attitude of the staff in the nursing homes, because we know, for example, that the old people should exercise and be outdoors and things like that, but they don't even try often in nursing homes when people are in final years to do the best of what's perfectly legal, like exercise and good nutrition. And yes, that's not a cure for aging, and it has a small effect, but they don't even often do that. They give up, essentially. That's the attitude, give up on old people because they're old.
That's a shame. Now, in your experience, have you had old patients who expressed an interest in at least leading a healthy lifestyle, but complain that they're not given opportunities? Maybe there aren't any supervised activities that they could participate in, or maybe they're not getting enough healthy food. Are there these kinds of basic problems where the staff just don't care enough?
Yes, I think that's very often the case, that when people are in the final years, people give up on them. However, I will of course, I have my own grandparents in their early 80s, and they are taking metformin for many years on my advice, and they have yearly Fisetin. They take regularly, like a senolytic. So I mean, I obviously try the small things that I can do for them and push that on them. So. And I think everybody should do that if you care about your grandparents within reasonable safety.
Yes, indeed. Now, I have occasionally spoken to some older individuals who kind of themselves may have given up, in the sense that they still want medical care, but they think, oh, I'm just going to leave it to the judgment of my doctors and my caretakers, and they know what they're doing. And I'm not an expert, and besides, I'm too old and tired to really think about such matters and bother myself. And I am always surprised when I encounter that kind of attitude, because I'm always the kind of person who wants to understand why something works. What effect is it going to have? How is it going to help me? What are the risks? So I always ask these kinds of questions. But what would you say to an older person who has that kind of mentality of, oh, I'm just going to trust my medical providers. Is there a way to change that person's mind?
Well, that depends. Obviously, a lot of doctors do not know a lot about aging, despite knowing a lot of medicine, because it's really bizarre. People do not study gerontology in medical school. The medical schools are still very old-fashioned, and despite that, most doctors spend most of their time treating diseases that occur in old people. Like an MD today, 90% of all their work is due to aging, but they are not trained for that. They're trained in a traditional medicine and not a gerontological aspect. So it's clearly lagging behind. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. And there are some interesting comments in the chat on this subject. So John H. believes that maybe many of these older patients have given up because some of their options are being blocked. So perhaps they think the day-to-day care that they're receiving is the best of what is available. And John thinks the patient gives up because he or she sees the institution giving up on them. And Alexandria thinks that so-called Dust Bowl babies, so people born in the 1920s, 1930s, were more likely to accept medical authoritarianism. And Jason thinks that people don't want to live in pain forever, and some of them want to give up as a result. What do you think about all of these hypotheses?
Yeah, I mean, partially, I definitely think it's a cultural thing, but that's only a problem that applies to the older generation. Obviously, the people who grew up 80 and 90 years ago, society was much more authoritarian there. I mean, women had not been allowed to vote for very long, and gays were outlawed. And I mean, of course, it was a completely different society, and you put a lot of trust in certain people, like the priest and the doctor, and whatever they said, you just did without questioning these people. And of course, they've grown up with that mentality. And obviously, lifespans were still much shorter then. So, of course, a person who's 90 years old today, they're probably really grateful that they have managed to live to 90, because they didn't grow up thinking that would be a certainty. But this generation that are growing up now, I mean, I believe almost certainly that I'm going to live to 75, but I don't expect to live a lot longer than that. That's reality.
And so, yeah, it is unfortunate that even those of us who are in our 30s today, without significant medical advances, are still going to face these massive health issues 40 to 50 years from now at best. So without biological age reversal, unfortunately, our fate will be the same as that of the prior generations. And that is definitely an outcome that I want to avoid. I know you want to avoid. And in our chat, Walter Crompton thinks that it will be possible to avoid it soon. He says, incremental health extension is about to give way to systemic age reversal. This will be a game changer that makes discussion of metformin, resveratrol, et cetera, seem quirky. So Walter is fairly optimistic in this regard. What do you think about his assessment, and how soon will this future arrive, of course, given that research continues to progress and we have institutions that become more supportive of this systemic age reversal? So what would you say is the best case scenario, and what would you say is a more middle of the road type of projection?
Well, obviously, I think that a lot of things are going to happen within the next few decades, but I don't feel comfortable giving a certain time frame. But as I see it, it's like you have a surface, and there's going to be a lot of breakthroughs through that surface simultaneously that are currently in the lab. So it might seem that nothing, and then everything. It might very well be that kind of scenario as well.
Yes, indeed. So this is definitely interesting to discuss, because you're tracking a lot of the day-to-day developments in the field. And where would you say are the bottlenecks in terms of research? Where do you think a major breakthrough would be needed before we start seeing a lot of these everyday gains to health and longevity, versus where do you think the progress is actually proceeding about as quickly as it can from a technical perspective?
Well, obviously, a better understanding of human biology is necessary, and that I certainly think that's a very interesting development with artificial intelligence and so on, and big data, and being able to build this big cell and protein atlases of the human body. Of course, the many of the research who does that, they don't have aging in mind, but that doesn't matter for us, because you can just compare gene expression in young and old people and so on. And essentially, if you can perfectly map on a molecular level what is a healthy 25-year-old, essentially their atomic state, what is a healthy 25-year-old, and be able to then directly see and neutralize all the changes that are not that exists in the old person but not in the young person. So obviously, when you have these kind of data models, and that's being slowly developed, but that is a very interesting thing, because that means that the area of medicine will change completely.
Very interesting. Now let's go to some of our other panelists to see what questions they have. David Shoemaker, what are some of the questions you would like to ask Victor?
Yeah, thank you. Victor, enjoyed your introduction very much, and enjoy following you around social media as well. But in your introduction today, you touched on three things that I'd like to spend a moment or two discussing. You talked about, your anti-aging career. You mentioned consultancy, and that interests me. And you mentioned a role as an activist. So the questions are similar. Looking at anti-aging career, you've been doing this for a while now. Would you consider this a career that you would speak to people that were launching their first career, perhaps preparing themselves for their first career, or a career change even perhaps? Would you recommend anti-aging as a career? And do you have a feel for what the outlook of anti-aging as a career looks like into the future?
Well, I have such a strong interest in it, so I would say it's almost like an accident that I would have to end up in this way, because that's like my moral imperative that I need to do something about this. But obviously, anyone could contribute to this in many different fields. You don't have to become a biologist necessarily, because, for example, if I had discovered that I had Justin Bieber's voice, then I would have become a singer, and I would have earned $100 million and put it in anti-aging instead. So I wouldn't have known what the mitochondria is. I wouldn't care, really. So of course, there are many ways that people can be able to contribute to accelerate the development forward.
Oh, excellent. Consultancy. So I think, if I remember right, you were consulting to people who want to invest in anti-aging research, maybe innovative type companies. Is that right? If you are, could you talk about that a little bit? I have an interest in that area, and I dabble very small amounts of money in anti-aging stocks and so forth myself.
I cannot talk anything about that. You have to contact me and talk about it. I cannot say anyone about the specific things I do like that.
Do you have a feel for the general overview? Do you think this is growing? This is I hear wild claims about what anti-aging research and companies will do. So I don't know.
Well, I mean, what I define as, what I essentially define as an anti-aging company is, of course, something that is a company that is developing a product that has been shown to affect lifespan or repair a part of aging damage that has been proven in a model such as a mouse and so on. So obviously, I have my own idea of what it would be versus not, if that what is likely to generate an outcome versus not. So
okay, yeah, thank you. And then the last one is activism. I guess we're all activists here at one level or another, or we wouldn't be participating in something like this. And perhaps so with the people that are watching us online as well. But I'm just curious, if you had to focus on one public policy that you wanted to put forth, whether it be in the European Union or whether it be here in the United States or elsewhere in the world, what would be the major thing that you would focus on from a public policy standpoint?
Well, I mean, I believe personally that people own their own bodies, and I believe that people should have the right to try whatever they like. So talking about safety in that sense, if people are well informed, doesn't make sense, because I mean, people can go and drink gasoline if they want. I mean, that's not very healthy, but everybody can do that. But as long as people are involved and informed, they should be allowed to do things to their own bodies. That probably sounds radical to some, but that's what I believe. And if people could freely use rapamycin or anything that they really see an effect from, that would improve the situation a lot.
It may be radical, but I think you'll find a lot of support for that idea here. Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, thank you, David. And now let's go to Art Ramon.
Not so much a question, but just an observation that the people who have the means, like the Queen of England, she's not getting any younger. Prince Philip just died. I mean, I don't think we're going to see anything until these people who have the means are actually benefiting from this. So what do we have to do to make sure they get these life improvement drugs or treatment so that we can get it? Any thoughts on that? I mean, the Queen of England not getting any younger.
Well, you mean she's of course very wealthy and she could fund a lot if she wanted.
Yeah, she could, but is she?
Yeah.
Does she care?
Well,
I mean,
I don't think it's that they just think it's impossible. They're not well informed. They don't think it's not a possibility. It's like saying to you, I mean, let's build a spaceship and go to the Andromeda galaxy. I mean, you might not be against it, but you don't see any feasibility how in the world that would be a possibility. So I don't think there's like a resistance that they want to age and die, but they don't see any scalability that it will benefit them or anyone.
okay, thank you.
So I'm curious, along these lines, you've interacted with people from various countries, people who are not aging researchers or experts in the field, and having traveled to the United States, spent a few months here, and then returned to Sweden. What differences and attitudes toward the feasibility and desirability of radical life extension have you observed? And have those attitudes shifted over time in any way per your recollection?
Well, I think there's a lot of change in that people are more accepting in general compared to a few years ago that you could at least partially modulate aspects of aging. I think I found a lot of sympathy, for example, that people should be allowed to self-experiment with metformin and simple things like that. I don't think that's so much harder to convince people than simple exercise and a healthy diet. I don't think it's very unusual to want to extend one's life. It's just that many people do not perceive it as that it's going to happen anywhere very soon. But I think, I mean, for example, I spoke to a senior university for like 200 people, and I asked them if they would take an anti-aging pill if it was like cheaply available in the local supermarket, and everybody said yes, of course. I mean, we're going to buy that product. So
it's interesting because in my interactions with people, mostly those who aren't stridently ideological don't have a problem with the desirability of indefinite life extension. And I would say about half of the people I speak with in the United States have a mildly positive reception to that. But I do think a lot of those people may still consider it to be within the realm of science fiction. So would you agree that showing feasibility to the general public in a way that they would understand is a more significant challenge right now than convincing people of the desirability of the entire life extension enterprise.
Yes, I think you need a good proof of concept and the more products that people perceive as undating, and that will change their attitudes to it. And I when you talk to people about infinite life extension, as I said before, it sounds like, oh, let's go to the Andromeda galaxy. They're not really against it, but they think that the person talking about it is not really aware and really sane about things. That's the perception people often get.
Interesting. So in Sweden, there's still this perception of it being a kind of fringe concept, at least from the standpoint of people who think it may happen anytime soon. I recall that perception in the United States as well around the mid-2000s. I think right now there has been enough media coverage that people are taking it more seriously. Most people still don't think it's going to happen in time for them, but they no longer think it's wildly out there. They just think it may be a bit later than they would be able to benefit from it. So has there been a similar shift to the public opinion in Sweden, or are they still back in that stage where they think you're crazy if you talk about it?
No, I don't think I rarely encounter people who think I'm crazy. It's just that they think it's not going to happen within the next few decades. But they might, if you ask them, will it happen in a few hundred years? Then they say yes, because it's not like an impossible, unimaginable time frame. But it might be too late for them, but not that far still. So.
Yes. So it seems like it is a question of time frames in people's minds and whether they expect it to be a matter of years, decades, or centuries. And clearly those who expect it to be a matter of centuries, they need to find some psychological coping mechanisms with the perceived inevitability of their mortality.
Yeah, and I was like to add also that I have not really encountered much problem with religious people. Whether you're an atheist or a religious person, it doesn't seem to matter a lot, because there are religious people who support life extension and there are atheists who are like against or completely uninterested. So I don't see such a correlation, for example.
Mm-hmm. And that has been my observation as well. That is, it would be far too simplistic to say that people who believe in an afterlife will have less concern about living longer here because maybe their God wants them to live longer in this world. Maybe it's an opportunity to do more good deeds, or maybe they just think if God wanted me dead, then he would have found a way. But if I'm still living, that means that's part of God's plan as well. So I definitely think religions are going to evolve to adapt to the technological reality and to maintain their relevance in a future of significantly longer lifespans. Not to mention that there are religions whose texts speak of mythical earlier times when people lived longer, even the book of Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree that it's not religiosity versus atheism that really is the bright line between those who support or oppose indefinite human life extension. But what do you think it is about certain people that either makes them more likely to support efforts at greatly lengthening human lifespans, or makes them more resistant? Because there is a small fraction of the population that really hates this idea for whatever reason. And in my experience, those have been in the United States either alt-right conspiracy theorists or left-wing neo-Malthusian back-to-nature types.
Yes. I will definitely say that I encountered the back-to-nature types. But it's interesting, they still use their cell phones and computers and stuff. They don't run around naked in the cave. So.
Yes, indeed. Now, right now in Sweden in particular, but it's spreading throughout other European countries and even in the United States to some extent, it seems a lot of the very young people they're more concerned about perceived negative human activity. If you think of Greta Thunberg and the Extinction Rebellion movement, and these people, they have a lot of energy. They seem to have a desire to improve the state of the world, but they think the best way they can improve the state of the world is to get some sort of urgent clampdown on human activity to combat climate change, but they don't seem to focus on the technological possibilities. Like if you ask them, well, what should people do to combat climate change? They don't talk about technological progress as much. They just say we should stop doing bad things. And what do you think that is going to have as its influence in terms of getting new people into our movement or more techno-optimistic movements? Because I don't see the same excitement in young people about space, about the progress of science and technology, about some cool futuristic type of environment that they might someday hope to inhabit. And I know for previous generations, even when our generation was a lot younger, we still had those hopes for a brighter future.
Yes, that's correct. I think that, of course, with longer lifespans, the argument will be that people will care more about the environment because it personally affects them. If you know that if I don't care about climate change, the water will flood through my windows in 100 years from now because of global warming. I mean, obviously, I'm going to personally care about it. I don't think people really, truly personally care a lot about things that are never going to affect them themselves, even if they say so. I just do not believe that the best way of engaging people is helping them see the consequences and take personal responsibility for that. And also, it's often, of course, easier to add, when it comes to technology, it's easier to add something good than to avoid something that is bad. For example, I mean, just like it's easier to add exercise than avoid the cake, it's easier to use microbes to break down plastic than to avoid plastic altogether. I mean, obviously, I believe in that kind of mentality. So.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. And also with regard to exercise and cake, which we should definitely discuss in a few minutes during this salon. But I really think these kinds of level-headed arguments about the best way to achieve goals like environmental sustainability or reversing climate change, that would be the way to speak to these young people. And perhaps we older, wiser individuals can turn around some of their thinking on this. But I wonder, what are some of the recommendations that you would have for engaging with a person who now might be half our age and might be just wanting to go out in the streets, do a school strike, scream at people because humans aren't doing enough to stop climate change? Can you turn these kinds of individuals into activists for our cause and have them adopt these more rational approaches?
Yes, well, I mean, that's what I say. I mean, I have a much younger sister who is 19 years old, and she is an anti-aging activist. So she likes everything I say. So, but of course, I think it would be really impactful if you could go out and speak in high schools and so on, and get young people to understand this concept, because I think a lot of people who could question a lot of things during their life are not very set in their ways of thinking. They are obviously going to listen to this. And I think, for example, it's a bit bizarre, because I know a lot of young people who they know what transhumanism is, and they are interested in things like they know, like Ray Kurzweil technology and that aspect, but they seem to have ignored the biological life extension aspect. So I'm not really sure why that's the case and how to really address that in the best way.
Yes, that is a bit perplexing, because for me, life extension was the gateway to the rest of transhumanism in many ways. For instance, I was introduced to the work of Aubrey de Grey in 2004, and then I read The Singularity is Near a few years later, and I was primarily interested in Ray Kurzweil's explanations about the progress of artificial intelligence and artificial augmentations as a means toward getting people to live longer, to solve problems that might be difficult to solve using the unaided human mind, or perhaps to replace organs that fail until such a time as a biologically identical replacement could be found.
Yes, indeed. But I think, of course, it has to do with the perception of the area as well, with what does future mean to a lot of people? What do people see in movies? What do they think? What does progress really mean for them? Because from my perspective, the most important progress, that is medical progress. I don't really necessarily have to be in a spaceship, and I don't have to live in a city with minimalistic, futuristic architecture with huge panorama windows and empty spaces. I mean, I can live in an old castle and have my 500-year-old body.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm quite fond of historical architecture as well. As an aside, I do not think the aesthetic of the future is going to be minimalism. I think it's going to be more along the lines of eclecticism, where it borrows stylistic elements from various epochs, various cultural traditions, and also adds some new experimental elements. But I would be disappointed if future humans decided to consign themselves to white walls and big windows everywhere. That just seems to be a waste of potential.
But the movie makers like that, it seems.
Yeah, I wonder if they've been influenced too much by mid-20th century modernist minimalists, but I suppose that's another discussion. Before we move toward exercise, lifestyle types of questions, we do have some questions from the audience that I think it would be interesting to get your input on. Walter Crompton asks, how do you feel about the idea that genetically programmed aging limits lifespan? And I know that there is a bit of a difference within the aging research community, where some would advocate essentially the wear and tear theory of biological aging, where it's just by the fact of you being alive, your cells, they break down, they accumulate waste products, and they function less effectively, and that is what results in the damage of aging. Others think there's some genetic program that operates, and that's why you see young people's bodies working really well, but they decline after a certain period of time when one has had time to have offspring and maybe function as a grandparent for a little while. So what do you think? Is there any merit to the genetic programming theory of aging, or do you think it's flawed?
I do not think there's a lot of evidence that it would be genetically programmed in humans as an organism. I think it's mostly a matter of wear and tear, and that the fact that our repair systems do not function better, and that also explains why, of course, many types of aging damages accumulate at roughly the same rates. So,
and then Alexandria is curious if you are aware of Michael Rose and his 55 theses. So, of course, Michael Rose did some of the first experiments to prolong the lifespans of fruit flies, and he has been doing this for nearly 40 years now. But one of his main techniques was through essentially evolutionary selection. He kept breeding generations of fruit flies that lived longer and longer and longer. And so he seems to think that it's not so much through engineering interventions that greater longevity would be achieved, but through certain, I would even say, lifestyle interventions that kind of harness built-in evolutionary dynamics. I spoke with him several times, and I'm going to offer a very simplistic account of what he said, but he does seem to focus extensively on diet, and particularly shifting one's diet to more of a paleo diet once one reaches middle age, like one's mid 40s or early 50s. And he seems to think it's never possible to become biologically young again, but it might be possible to stay biologically middle-aged indefinitely. What do you think about that perspective? Do you think he's mistaken somewhere along the way in his reasoning?
Well, I don't think. Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you repair a human, you would be able to repair them all the way back to their 20s. That wouldn't be I mean, repairing an 80-year-old back to 50 would not necessarily be much easier than going all the way back to 20. I mean, obviously, when it comes to interventions that will selectively also breed the flies, for example, to live longer. I mean, obviously, we want life extension for currently living people. We don't want these gradual generational things in the thousands of years that people will live slightly longer thanks to epigenetic changes and so on. We want currently living people to live as long as they want. That's the goal. And currently living people are very, very unlikely to live longer than 90s, something slightly longer than the previous generations, but not a lot. And of course, I want to point out that exercise and healthy diets and so on, that affects mechanisms that are known to modulate longevity, like insulin resistance and things like that improve with diet and exercise. And the mTOR pathway, if you would take rapamycin and so on, that affects naturally inbuilt systems in the human body to make it more likely that we live longer. So yes, but there obviously the data that we have that is on currently living people, and the longest living places in the world, that's Okinawa in Japan, where females live to about the age of 90. So obviously there's a sharp limit. There's a lot we can do to cut cancer and strokes for people in the 60s and 70s, but it becomes a lot harder when people reach their 90s because there are so many different things that add up simultaneously. So that's why I think the Kalman limit, the limit of 122 is going to be very hard to break down without a significant biotechnological breakthroughs. But I think definitely a lot of people who exercise and live healthy are even going to live to their early hundreds.
So yes, exercise, it seems, can be great at incrementally extending lifespan and enabling those years of life to be freer of disease. But in terms of increasing maximum lifespan, we need reversal of biological senescence. Now, I do hope that people use exercise as a strategy to enable themselves to live long enough to reach those advances, because those few years could be critical in whether one makes it to longevity escape velocity or not. So along these lines, you and I are runners, and there are other prominent members of the longevity community who engage in long distance running. Bill Andrews is the most famous one. He is an ultra marathoner. He has competed in over 200 ultra marathon races. And while he has been active his entire life, most of those races were run after his late 40s. So that's interesting as well, that he was able to keep this, by most people's standards, extreme level of activity in an age when most people would decide to slow down. So what has your research shown in particular about the benefits of distance running? And would you say that is the best exercise for enhancing longevity?
Well, I believe in a combination of exercises. Obviously, you need to do a lot of cardio that enhances your respiratory capacity and so on. So ideally, an old person should do a mixture of both. I wouldn't say a marathon, but I will say if you can jog 10 or 20 kilometers, 10, 15 miles, that kind of distance is probably a really good thing to aim for. Marathon can take a bit of too much toll on the aging body. But then of course combine that with strength training, because that's of course the muscle fibers and the sarcopenia that you end up combating. So I would probably say a mixture of activities like swimming, running, and the gym for people.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. And what motivated you to get into exercise and create your own regimen?
Well, obviously you want to stay healthy, to live, to normalize your whatever you can do today.
And when you were doing the move from California to New York last year during the pandemic, we decided to hold the first Victor Run virtual race in order to raise funds for you to cover some of your moving expenses. And this year, we have done it again with the Victor Run 2021. The medals have just been created, and you can see I'm wearing one right now. For those of you who are curious about what the Victor Run is, between June 4th and June 6th of this year, if you ran or walked any distance, you're eligible to submit it via a form on the Transhumanist Party website. And I'm going to post the link to the Victor Run page on the website, as well as the form for submitting the results. Both of those are available in the YouTube chat right now. And if you submit this form today, just today, you will still be eligible to get one of these bright, shiny medals with this running logo that incorporates aspects of the US Transhumanist Party logo. Now this year, this was a fundraiser for life extension research and advocacy organizations. You have the option to donate to SENS, lifespan.io, which is LEAF, the Lifespan Extension Advocacy Foundation, or Longevity. And if you donate $30 to any of these organizations, you will be eligible for this medal. And this is also in line with the goal of pursuing longevity, because we try to give people incentives to run longer and stay active for a longer period of time. So we have a scoring system that is described on the website that I linked. And the scoring system rewards you based on speed, distance, and elevation gain. So you get a larger point multiplier for every mile that you run faster. And I did say if you break the world record, which is under a 4-minute mile, then you automatically win the virtual race. So far, we haven't had anyone do that. But the more effort you put in, the higher your point total. So even if you're not able to run fast, but you're able to run or walk for a long time, that adds to your points. Again, because the efforts, staying active and remaining persistent, I would say, are more important than what you can immediately do today. So I tried to design an incentive system that acknowledges that. So Victor, what are your thoughts on the Victor Run? You've, of course, participated in it both years. What have you gotten out of this experience?
Well, I think it's a wonderful way of getting people together to do something that is both healthy for them and that supports the movement. So it would be great if one could have several people meeting up and doing things together at many different places. People are into life extension, and maybe that works another year when there is no corona around and so. So I think it's very interesting.
Yes, absolutely. So right now in the United States, because a decent fraction of the population is fully vaccinated, in-person running events have resumed. And sometimes there are still a few quirks and precautions, but largely speaking, if you live in an area with any concentration of population, you should be able to find a running race to sign up for and participate, or a local running club that does casual runs. But even if that's not the case, there are many organizations that will hold virtual races like the Victor Run, except they do them more frequently, and you can sign up on their websites, record your results, get a medal. There are various distance options. So I would recommend it, but I would especially recommend the Victor Run because, as you can see, this is a unique type of keepsake that you will only be able to get through participation in it. And if you like the background behind me, imagine seeing that on a medal. Surely, I hope that some of you will be interested in receiving this. But also, I'm curious, Victor, with regard to advice that you would have for people who are just trying to get into extensive physical activity, because I know there are probably some people even in the audience who think that we're a little extreme, or that Bill Andrews is extreme in terms of what he does. How would you respond to those people?
Well, I believe they should try and push themselves.
I concur. I concur. And of course, there's a lot of intrinsic motivation that's involved. If you want to live longer, if you want to be healthier, you're going to push yourself. What about the kind of person who might need a little more persuasion? Is there a gentler way to get them started and kind of get them hooked on physical activity, so that then after they've gotten to a certain point, maybe they're able to run a mile without any issues, then they decide to continue and see how far they can go?
Well, unfortunately, I think that there's a lot of people who are sick and then wake up because of that, and that should ideally not be the case. But let's say someone who goes to the doctor and discover that they have a super high blood pressure or something like that, and then that might function as something to motivate them. But I do think that if you do something that and you are held accountable for it online in front of a lot of people, that will generally motivate you to do things that will keep you make you execute things, because you're held accountable for something.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is where virtual races and other kinds of public events help people with the motivation, because then they commit to doing something, to showing a result for it. So
yes, and they get a physical object like a medal for it, then that's kind of rewarding for the brain.
Absolutely. And these kinds of medals, they will be there with you for a long time, even after the strain, the exhaustion, whatever discomfort you feel during the exercise will long have passed. But also, I would say this is important to consider for somebody who thinks running is difficult or uncomfortable. And certainly there are moments when that can be the case. But there are also possibilities for someone who is well trained to run a long distance and not feel any pain or unpleasantness. This happens to me fairly frequently with half marathons. So a half marathon is 13.1 miles, or about 21.1 kilometers. And I can run those, particularly the faster ones, and not feel pain or discomfort. Of course, if I'm able to run them faster, it means that my body is in a better state. Perhaps I've eaten well on that day. Perhaps I've waited a few hours after eating before I start running. I find that helps, and I have good hydration and nutrition throughout the way. One of the pieces of advice that Bill Andrews gave me is that in order to avoid hitting what is called the wall, which many runners encounter around mile 20, of a marathon, but sometimes it can happen earlier. If you're in the earlier stages of your training, you might hit it around mile 10. Is you should get some consistent carbohydrate intake during your run. So a good benchmark is 25 grams of carbohydrates every 5 miles. And that's actually not a lot in terms of caloric intake. Generally speaking, you can get that in a food that might have around 100 calories. So you're still burning a lot more calories than you are taking in. Keep in mind, a half marathon for a male runner of average weight might burn 1,500 calories. So what that carbohydrate does is it enables you to keep using immediately available stores of energy in order to keep running at a good pace. So that's something to keep in mind as well. If you drink plenty of fluid, if you have periodic intake of nutrition, and after very long distances, if you also take in sufficient electrolytes to compensate for the ones that are depleted, you can feel fairly comfortable. Now, that's not a guarantee that you won't have little pains or your muscles won't feel strained. Sometimes that happens, there's nothing you can do about it, but it won't be just a hellish experience. You will have moments, sometimes significant stretches of time when you actually enjoy the experience. So maybe that's some positive motivation for people. What do you think? Would the prospect of being able to run a half marathon free of pain or discomfort appeal to at least a decent share of individuals who are thinking about doing this?
Yes, I think so. That's a reward to many and a sign of physical ability. So. Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, and Jason has a good point in our internal chat. He says he wonders if it would help if we said the runner's high is better than drugs. And I would say, of course it's better. I don't take any mind-altering substances other than caffeine, but I do know that the experience that one gets while running, it certainly releases endorphins naturally. It's an experience of achievement. It's an experience of the capacity that one has to do something remarkable. And it's an enjoyable experience. It's particularly enjoyable because it's earned and you know that it corresponds to healthier, life-affirming outcomes. And there's another comment in the chat from Zach Richardson, who says he really admires runners and points out that in a very early edition of The Rational Argumentator, back in 2002, there was an essay by Edmund Daleford that was quite inspiring. It described the practice of running as an epitome of the spirit of individualism, because nobody can run for you. You have to do it yourself. So it's your accomplishment. It's not unlike in other sports, a situation where you can just be on a team benefit from somebody else's work. Running is your own activity. And really, even though I run in physical races and virtual races, I primarily see the competition as being a competition with myself, to see how I can improve, whether I can go faster, go longer, feel better, and be healthier as a result. So no matter where you are, wherever you start, it is a way for an individual to improve and demonstrate this capacity for achievement that I think we all have within us. So also Alexandria says maybe the endorphins come to push through pain. Well, yes, they diminish the perception of any pain that might otherwise arise, even if you do pull a muscle, for instance, and you're able to keep running. You don't experience that as much while you're running as you would several hours or a day afterward. But that's a good thing. It is an evolved mechanism to enable you, for instance, to return home, or in a more primeval setting, escape from danger. If you're running and you experience pain or a strain, you don't want it to debilitate you right away. You want to get to safety and have room to recover without any imminent threats. So yes, that could happen as well. Recovery becomes easier with practice. So I can run a half marathon one day and then the half marathon the next day. I did a week of consecutive half marathons earlier in June. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend you doing that to start. It takes a while to build up to that. And there is a bit of cumulative fatigue that takes a few days to subside and for the body to return to a more typical state after that. However, the number of days of rest and recovery definitely diminishes with practice. So those are my thoughts. Any further thoughts, Victor, on running? And also, let's get back to this issue of diet versus exercise. So it's easier to eat a cake and run than not to eat the cake at all. Do you think that could be a motivator for people?
Yes, for sure. That's a fact. And I think also something that you might think about is the hormesis effect. That's something that is actually challenging yourself and push yourself for something that is technically bad might actually improve your condition. For example, I mean, we know hormesis, that's something that is objectively bad for you, but that produces a beneficial outcome. So all exercise, for example, is hormetic. It's bad by itself. If you don't have any nutrition and you exercise, you're worse off than if you don't exercise and have any nutrition. But the body's repair system is activated, so the net gain is that exercise is good for you. So there are many such situations in both life. You could say some people become better people because of harmful events earlier on. For example, growing up in misery might make some people more motivated, for example, to have a successful life. So there are many instances like that one can.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and clearly exercise and nutrition go together. Which would you say is the more significant contributor to longevity and being free of disease? So for instance, let's say someone runs long distances and eats, let's say, a fairly ordinary diet, but doesn't really do a whole lot to very carefully select ingredients or avoid certain foods, versus another person who is very rigorous at dieting but doesn't exercise very much. Which individual do you think will have better health outcomes?
Well, that's a hard question to answer. I know, for example, in mice, then exercise does not seem to matter a lot when it comes to calorie restriction, because the mice live longer with calorie restriction, but they don't live a lot longer when you exercise. But of course, when it comes to long-living people, like the people in Okinawa in Japan, who they have both better diet and a lot more physical activity. But it's actually, to disappoint you a little bit here, the oldest people on the planet, the super centenarian, they don't deviate when it comes to health behaviors. If you don't smoke, if you have a normal weight, if you exercise, you're much more likely to reach your 90s than the average person, but not 110, not 110, 115. These people are equally fat, they smoke equally much, so there's a bit of a difference here. That the average longevity can certainly be enhanced, but the lucky few at the top, there you seem to have a mainly genetic component or epigenetic, we don't actually know.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it does seem to be a genetic component. So Jean Calment was a chain smoker, for instance. Do you think she could have lived maybe to 125 or 130 if she didn't smoke? Or do you think that she reached her maximum no matter what she could have done in her life?
We don't know her cause of death because she was not autopsied. It was likely a heart attack because it was not expected death despite her age. But depending on the cause of death, she will certainly have been a little bit cleaner in her lungs if she had not smoked, for example. So we don't know if that would have translated to her lasting a few months longer, but I think the bulk was genetic, but maybe she could have topped it a little bit with healthy habits.
Yes, indeed. Now, you have met some supercentenarians, most notably Emma Morano, who lived to 117. What were some of your impressions of these individuals and their habits and their outlooks on life?
Well, yeah, she was a very interesting person. I mean, because obviously she was mentally sharp and she was able to remember things from 110 years ago. So she never developed dementia. So it's clear that these people who live to 117, like her, they are slower aging people. When you look at old photographs of her, she looked younger than her real age. I met her at like 115, but she did not look different than people who are like in their 90s. There's no way you can really tell. And when you looked at the old picture of her when she was 90, she was more like a 70-year-old in appearance. And so there was this clear delay. I mean, they have this repair system, so it's not going to be a single thing. It's extreme longevity. Yes, it's partially being lucky and not getting a cancer, but it's also a quite big systemic effect that they're simply better at maintaining their functionality in organs. So yeah, and I also sort of learned that I mean, it's definitely worth it if you can live to 117 and avoid cancer. Why should she be allowed to do it but others not, because she was lucky, or what?
Yes, exactly. If we can harness some of those aspects of what is currently genetic luck and apply them in a systematic manner to all humans, I think that would be wonderful.
Yes, and it's such an obvious example because, for example, if you lived in the medieval ages, you knew that you cannot fly, but you knew that flying was possible because you saw birds and so on. But now it should be fairly obvious to a person that if she can live to 117, her body can do that. I mean, then you can induce the same thing in everybody else. Of course, you could live a lot longer in theory, but that's like a clear example.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. Alexandria says in our chat, always steal from nature. Well, if there's a proof of concept that it's possible, especially if it's possible in humans, then yes, why not extend that to as many people as we can? Now, it's also interesting because Jean Calment set this record of 122 years. And since that time, very few people have even approached that vicinity. Nobody has lived to 120 years other than Jean Calment. And currently the record holder is Kane Tanaka, who is 118. So do you think that it would be feasible in this decade to have someone surpass her record? Because I think if someone does, that is going to make major headline news, and that is going to lead a lot of people interested in life extension because they see some modest feasibility in the sense that lifespans would, again, maximum lifespans be gradually increasing over time.
Yes, certainly. So I think there's a lot of pessimism because of the difficulty in breaking that particular record and so on. We don't see the records being broken, but of course we don't even have the data of the whole world. So there might be someone in China who's older, for example, but that lacks the birth records. But I think, of course, with a growing population, a larger initial pool of centenarians, we're going to see somebody surpass her, but I'm not really sure that's very interesting still, because I mean, it's going to be like 123 and 124 somewhere around that region. The interesting thing will be someone surpasses Jean Calment and has received any therapy, any partial reversing therapy, someone who would have lived to 115 naturally and had genetics, but had on addition took like senolytics and had a few other interventions and manages to exceed her. That will certainly make major headlines.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you think any of these therapies that could conceivably be on the horizon would be viable in people who are in their 110s, already, or do we essentially need to wait for people to, say, receive them in their 60s or 70s, become biologically younger, and then live for another 5-6 decades before we can say that they have indeed exceeded prior longevity records because their aging had been reversed at some point earlier in life?
Well, I mean, it depends on the invasiveness of the therapy. So obviously, if it's going to be major surgery and very complicated things, then you prefer 70-year-olds over 110-year-olds, because of course many people who are very old are so messed up biochemically that they don't respond as they should to things. But my guess, I don't have solid evidence obviously for it. Simple things like senolytics and breaking up transthyretin amyloidosis, that can be implemented even in someone who is 110, because the invasiveness, it does not involve surgery. It's a pill. It doesn't affect a lot of off-target effects necessarily. So that it depends on the therapy. But of course, I mean, I would personally hope that everything is available when I'm 70 and not have to barely try something when I'm in my final years.
Yes, indeed. And based on what I understand from Aubrey de Grey, the younger one is, clearly one would have to have accumulated some damage from senescence for repair therapy to work. But the younger one is when that therapy is administered, the greater the potential effectiveness. So it would be better to be 60 and have the biological age be reverted to 40 than to be 110 and have it be reverted to 70. A lot of older patients I know, sometimes when they're faced with a chronic illness, even potentially a cancer, will get told by their doctors it's probably not worth it to surgically remove the problem, because the person would have greater risks from the surgery than from just leaving it alone, because another chronic condition may be likelier to kill that person before the cancer does, or the other serious disease would.
Yes, of course, and that contributes. I mean, obviously, in the case of cancer, elderly are much more likely to get cancer in the first place, and to treat cancer in elderly is a bit of a problem because they cannot withstand the therapies that a young person can. So I'm not sure if that fully explains, but of course, you have much better survivability in young people who get cancer because they can actually tolerate the treatment at least. So then it's the cancer and its ability to escape that matters more. But when it comes to a 90-year-old, even the slightest effect from chemotherapy can kill them. So,
yes, indeed. So now let us see what other questions our audience has generated. Now, Alexandria Black asks, what do you think evolutionary biology adds to longevity research? I know we spoke a bit about Michael Rose and his ideas, but what about evolutionary biology more generally? What insights could it reveal that might explain, for instance, why some people are genetically more favored to live longer?
well, obviously, longevity, for example, is not a trait that is selected for, because it's not beneficial. People never live to more than 30 to 40 in nature. So it's not a characteristic that is going to be selected for. I mean, what is suppose that you are a very good-looking woman who look like a supermodel, and you can easily have 20 children without miscarriage. I mean, the fact that you're going to get breast cancer and die at 40 doesn't matter because you have fulfilled your role. But then someone who is, let's say, very tiny and has myopia, but has the genetics to live to 110. I mean, that person will not be selected for in nature. So yes, evolutionary biology certainly matters, but obviously longevity is not a trait that is important from that kind of view. Yes.
It's interesting too, because there are certain organisms that don't reproduce in the same way that humans or other mammals do. So the Turritopsis dornii jellyfish, for instance, it transdifferentiates back into a juvenile state after a while. And so the same organism undergoes this life cycle of getting older and then becoming younger. And I'm not sure to what extent it has memories or a sense of self and whether that is preserved, but it's an interesting model. And I just think it's such a shame that for organisms of our degree of sophistication and intricacy and ability to understand the world, to reason about it, to create, we have this evolutionary model which treats the individual as disposable. One does one's role, reproduces, and then one is not needed anymore. I just wish that there were a different model that favored the survival of the individual, and maybe people would reproduce a lot less frequently, but the individual, him or herself, would be much more durable.
Yeah, sure. Of course, I perceive the individual life as being hugely important. I don't think we are some kind of furniture that you just throw away and replace like anything.
Yes, absolutely. Now, Jason Geringer asks, given that Uplift, which is a mediated artificial intelligence that is currently under development by AGI Laboratories, said that curing aging is its third goal. How do you think we will be able to use AI in anti-aging research? It seems there are various attempts to develop AI systems that would be able to contribute to this endeavor.
Well, obviously, it's a gigantic advantage when it comes to research, handling big data, making predictions for what is going to likely to work for a particular molecular target and a system. And also, if you have a good model of an organism to predict the systemic effects and side effects. So everything, all aspects of research gets a lot easier. But then, I mean, that's always the thing that I'm thinking about. Somebody else maybe think about merging with AI and replacing our brain or whatever. But I think about facilitating the research. That's how I think of AI.
Yes, that's what I think about as well. The computational capability being leveraged to solve problems that would be difficult for the unaided human mind. Jason, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I think you mentioned something about making a model to like a body. Is that what I was hearing, that it might help if like an AI got a body, and then we could study how that body works to help? Was that what you meant?
Well, I said if you had a computer simulation of a human on a molecular level, that will ideally be able to essentially predict every way of curing aging in the least harmful way possible. Yeah.
Wonder if that could be a joint area of research, longevity and robotics.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yes, well, I think there could be a lot of synergies among these fields. Some of the most remarkable technological advances come not from a single field, but when multiple fields intersect and the knowledge from each of these disciplines is brought to bear on the other. This is why it's very difficult to predict the aftermath of a technological singularity, like what I believe the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and the information revolution to have been. It's not a single advance that led to them, it's a convergence of advances.
Well, I'd like to add there that that's a major problem I feel in aging research, because almost all people are specialized in a narrow area, and there are very few people who for example, over the gray is an exception, but most people do not think in a transdisciplinary way. They are an expert on this little pathway, and maybe that will modulate longevity or not. But that's how academia works. People are very, very focused on a very narrow area, and you cannot be that with such a complex problem as aging. You have to put your nose everywhere where you see an opportunity.
And I think this brings us full circle to the start of the conversation, where I asked you what could people do to get started on their own paths. It seems that there's a need for these transdisciplinary thinkers, people who learn a lot about the specific areas, but aren't so narrowly specialized in them that they can still see the connections, build the bridges, because it seems there are many good specialists, including people who are in very conventional occupations who have studied their little niches extensively, but there's information there and potential applications that have not been brought out to the broader world or even the broader research community. So it's the siloing problem that we need more people to work to overcome. Now, for people who try to do that, of course, the conventional academic pathways are going to be difficult, because in a conventional academic pathway, you get your undergraduate degree with some specialization, and that's fine. Most people do that, but it's still sufficiently general as to be very versatile. But then you go to graduate school, and the people who want to teach or become employed in a lot of organizations, corporations that focus on research, they often will need to get a PhD, and a PhD means you focus on this very, very narrow slice of your field about which you write a dissertation, which is supposed to be new groundbreaking research, but it could be research about an aspect that is very focused and that almost nobody else will even know about. So what are some alternatives for people who don't want to go down that path, but want to be these kinds of bridge builders?
Yes, obviously the solution there would be to go into entrepreneurship. And obviously you can self-learn, you can work with a lot of different companies, but you have to self-learn. I was a bit skeptical to that myself. So I don't have a PhD. If I did a PhD, then I would have to, if I had to do a PhD that was optimal for my brain, I will have to go into one area for like 3 months and then switch to the next area another 3 months and go on for that 3 years. I could not sit and hyper specialize in one thing that might not turn out to matter for aging in any way, even. That's how the system works, unfortunately.
And I have quite a similar mindset, actually. My most famous YouTube video by far is a video from 2011 entitled "Reasons Not to Pursue a PhD." Type that into the YouTube search and you will find it. I'm still of the mindset that there are a lot of disadvantages for an individual in pursuing a PhD path. I do qualify in that video that if a person is really enthusiastic about the field and wants a career in academia, then a PhD may still be the right decision. But for many people, including people with our mindsets, it would be extremely difficult to limit oneself to just this one narrow area of research. I always want to see how a particular field of study affects the broader picture of the human condition. Everything from the meaning of life and our place in the universe to how we can make day-to-day existence better. I always ask those kinds of questions with regard to every field that I study or do any work in.
Yes, I completely agree with that. And I also, even worse, I will say that's the people who feel so forced to do a PhD that they don't even do a PhD in the area that they're interested in. So, I mean, for example, if I am very interested in curing aging, but then I get the opportunity to do a PhD at Harvard, but that PhD is on a mushroom, should I go and spend 5 years studying a mushroom just to get the PhD from Harvard title? I don't think so. But some people will not reason that way.
Yes, some people may well pursue a PhD for instrumental purposes because they think it enhances their prestige or their employability. I'm not so sure about the latter, by the way, because I think back in 2011 when I made the video, the statistic was 16% of PhD holders actually get jobs in academia in the United States. That proportion could have changed since then, but it's still not the majority. So in terms of financial prospects or employment prospects, I don't think a PhD really matters. If a person thinks it's needed for credibility or prestige, I'm not going to second guess that judgment necessarily, but I will say there are other paths for people who don't want to do that. And those other paths may offer a bit more freedom to be creative, to see those connections across disciplines, and to work in a greater variety of areas that might be just as remunerative. So I definitely appreciate your perspective. We have a few comments in the chat. Daniel Twet says, perhaps a bit in jest, can someone get a PhD in generalism? Jennifer Hughes says, generalists are so underrated. And we also have Didier Cornell, one of the big supporters of longevity, who also has taken a bit of an unconventional path to get to the point of being a major activist in the field, who writes, a big problem with big data and health is that there's a lot of bad data. And in his humble opinion, this is because of private interest companies owning data and not enough will to share for science. So any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure. Of course, I mean, a lot of science is behind the paywalls and so on. So I'm not sure if that could be a contributing factor. But on the other hand of the coin, of course, if there's no patent to make any money and so on, people will be less likely to do it. That would be the counter argument.
Yes, and I know that Didier is a strong advocate of open sourcing of research and data so that scientists from many different institutions, many different labs can corroborate the results and know that it's not just a particular anomaly that led to a certain conclusion. But it is an interesting conversation, probably not one we will be able to delve into at length today, about the extent to which patents incentivize or disincentivize research progress. I think that the time frame for patents should be greatly reduced at the very least, because then the entity that holds the patent would still have a first mover advantage, but others would be allowed to make the incremental innovations sooner. Now, David, it looked like you had some thoughts to contribute to this conversation.
Yeah, my background comes from engineering. So we have the same PhD issue, I guess, that everybody else has, because engineers can be extremely specialized. But systems engineers bring all of that together. Their whole idea is to manage these systems of smaller subsets. And because engineering is based on building something, whether it be civil engineering or electronic engineering or whatever it might be, it also means managing life cycles and bringing all the other engineers into play. So that comment about getting a PhD in generalism really maybe should be taken more seriously. That there is an idea, I think, with recent emphasis on things like complexity theory versus reductionism, I think that's another thing that would go towards pointing for the need that you need to have an advanced degree that brings all these other areas together. And that's not going to appeal to everybody, but it certainly could appeal to people that want to deal at the macro level instead of focused at the micro level. So also I've been reading about and fantasizing about ideas for the patent replacement system, since we touched on that as well. And blockchain has a level that it can play in that with decentralized record keeping that can be very trusted, and integrating that with micro contracts, maybe even nano contracts, if you will, and corresponding finance. And what does that do? But it takes us out of these silos and allows me to publish and be paid if somebody else takes that information, because it's trusted and they can do it in very small increments and advance that. So maybe it is an economic model that's not too dissimilar from open source, except in this particular case, there is compensation and recognition that goes with it. So it's another topic, but there
Sounds
are
interesting.
possible solutions to some of these things that we're talking about.
Yes, indeed. And I'm curious along these lines, Victor, what are your thoughts about the intersection of blockchain technology and longevity research? Because it does seem like many people who support longevity research financially are in the blockchain space. Vitalik Buterin is a prominent example, but he's not the only one. So where do you see any synergies between those two fields in the future?
I'm not really certain that is a direct connection between the blockchain and the longevity itself, but it's more the individuals who are interested in blockchain tend to be interested in longevity because both are willing to think outside the box and go outside the system. I mean, you have people who use cryptocurrencies, and they obviously have a belief that it's going to be a better way than the printed money.
Yes, indeed. So the willingness to think creatively, find new solutions, not necessarily trust established paradigms and ways of thinking by default, is what unites these fields. And I would imagine a lot of people who are interested in both of these fields will be interested in other emerging technologies as well, because it is a matter of mindset. If you think one area of existence is not fixed and immutable and always going to be like the status quo, then your mind is already primed to also raise those alternative possibilities in other areas as well. And this is why I believe that transhumanism as a more comprehensive philosophy and worldview is ideal for life extension advocates and other technology enthusiasts to implement and to study and to work out the implications of, because progress isn't just going to happen in one field. It's going to be this convergence of innovations and developments, and transhumanism as a philosophy really provides a framework around understanding that and taking it to the next level. So we're coming to a point in our salon where I think we are moving toward a conclusion. I understand it's past midnight in Sweden now, but we have touched on a variety of subjects, from your personal journey to the state of the research into longevity and the medical practice, as well as fitness, exercise, health, the extent to which healthy habits matter. And I'm curious, Victor, after this conversation, is there anything that you would like to add or develop further, or is there anything that we didn't mention that you would like to bring up right now?
I think that everybody should think always, how can I get to this movement to grow? How can I get everybody involved? What can I actually do as an individual to maximize my own impact? That is.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, I think to people who are asking the question of what they can do as individuals, they want to have role models to look up to, people who have tried to do that themselves and have achieved a measure of success. And I think you will be one of the people to whom others will look as an example of what could be achieved. And I think many of our viewers who want to become longevity advocates and activists themselves are going to be interested in your future endeavors. So what is next for you? Where can people follow your future progress and keep up with your new endeavors and activities and achievements?
Well, obviously, I will continue to post on social media about anything I do. And I, of course, have in my turn the people that I look up to that really try to change this. Like, of course, I look up to people like Aubrey de Grey and Kelsey Moody and so on. So that I really try to set up this kind of industry.
Yes, and I think this is one of the great aspects of the longevity community. It is this vibrant network of companies, projects, but fundamentally people who have this motivation to overcome the greatest problem of the human condition. And these are people to whom we should all look up as examples, and you included. I wish you and Aubrey de Grey and Kelsey Moody and anyone who is an entrepreneur, a researcher, an activist in the field of longevity, all the best. You are the people who are at the forefront of this fight and who have a serious chance at radically steering the future of humanity for the better. So thank you very much for joining us this evening, Victor, for a stimulating 2-hour conversation. And to all of our audience, I think this is another great example of a virtual Enlightenment Salon where we've built these bridges and connections across disciplines. We strive to do that every Sunday, generally at 1 p.m. US Pacific time. And until next time, please take care of your health, go out for a run if you can, participate in the Victor Run 2021 virtual race. This is your last day to submit results and get this medal. And of course, live long and prosper.
Mm-hmm.